This episode of Bullet Heaven was made using Pack-a-Punch SCART cables from Retro Gaming Cables, the OSSC from Video Game Perfection, and the Retrobit 2.5 GHz Wireless Saturn controller from Stone Age Gamer. Success is a developer that has surfaced a few times here on Bullet Heaven, with games such as shooter Starfighter Sandfine on the original PlayStation, Cyverior Delta on PS4 and Switch, and of course, Fantastic Night Dreams Cotton for the PC Engine. But over the years, we've seen a decent amount of requests and recommendations for another success title, this time on the Sega Saturn.
Guardian Force is a dynamic scrolling vertical shooting game that saw release to the Sega Saturn by Success in 1998. It was originally supposed to be a Saturn exclusive, but took an unexpected turn when it abruptly shifted to Sega Titan Video arcade machines for its debut. Thanks to the STV system being based completely on Saturn hardware, the Saturn version is, for all intents and purposes, arcade perfect. It's also one of those games that sports an exorbitant price tag. So, how does it hold up? Let's take a look.
There are several different control setups available in Guardian Force, which are also totally customizable. There is sure to be a setup that any player will feel comfortable with, though the default controls will only be truly usable if playing with an arcade stick for reasons we'll get into shortly. For this review, we're playing with the Select 1 setup.
Tanks are the weapon du jour in Guardian Force, in this case, hover tanks. But the core controls at play when it comes to moving around the screen are as basic as they come.
While the player will always have consistent control over their tank, the stages they'll be playing through will scroll dynamically throughout each stage. Very few games change scroll direction like Guardian Force does, much less mid-stage and even less so by adding diagonal scroll. It adds a neat wrinkle to the overall gameplay, which is something we appreciate.
Players fire their weapons with the B button by default, or the A button using Select 1. There are two fire types in Guardian Force: a core shot that fires in the direction the stage is scrolling, and a turret shot that can be aimed in 8 main directions. The turret can be rotated counterclockwise or clockwise by using the A and C buttons by default, or the L and R buttons in Select 1.
The turret will rotate as long as the button is held, and shots can still fire within 360 degrees. However, the turret will only stop at the nearest 45 degrees when the button is released. The turret buttons can also simply be pressed once, which will move the turret to the next position of 8 in the desired direction.
The player's fire can be changed by collecting a weapon drop from certain enemies. These weapon change pickups will cycle through several colors, each corresponding to a different weapon. Red for the default Tusk Cannon, yellow for a laser called the Feeler, green for a yo-yo style weapon called the Fang, purple for the splash damaging horn bullets, and blue for the Beak rocket launcher.
The player can power up their weapons to a maximum level of 10 through the collection of pink force crystals that are released from various enemies. These force crystals bounce on the ground, meaning that players can only grab them at a certain height unless they're already on the ground. A gauge in the bottom corner of each player's respective screen side will show the progress they've made and the current weapon level achieved. At death, the player will release a few crystals for recollection in an effort to help regain some of the power lost. Changing weapon types does not affect the current weapon power.
But it goes even further. Both Player 1 and Player 2 have a slightly asymmetrical weapon system. Player 1 will have more focused, more powerful weapons, while Player 2 will have slightly speedier, more diffuse, and weaker fire. There's a balance between the two, so no one player is more powerful than the other overall, but players may be more comfortable using the Player 2 tank rather than Player 1.
The player's fire can also be enhanced with missiles, which can be enabled by picking up a missile icon which will cycle between two types: straight firing missiles indicated with a blue M, or homing missiles when the pickup changes to an orange H. Especially in the case of homing missiles, these can help in catching enemies that players might not be able to hit in time before they unload on the player. Collecting more of these will increase the amount of missiles fired at a time.
Players also have a special weapon that deals heavy damage and clears away bullets like a bomber would in a typical shooter, but outside of clearing enemy shots, their damage paths are more restricted and almost purely directional. This weapon is deployed with the B button in Select 1, but requires that both A and C be pressed in arcade. This is why the default controls are far from ideal, unless players are using an actual arcade stick setup.
Every different weapon in the game also has a unique special attack to go with it, and once again, the Player 1 and Player 2 specials will be different with a much more pronounced variance than the core firepower. The player will start with a default loadout of 3 specials, and additional specials can also be collected and added to the stock.
And this all sounds well and good on paper, but the truth of the matter is we never felt especially comfortable with Guardian Force's gameplay. It always felt as if the player's firepower wasn't strong enough to do the kind of damage required in crowded situations. It is definitely very easy to get overwhelmed by combinations of small and large enemies approaching from all angles, firing from every direction, and all of which take a lot of effort to take out.
It certainly doesn't help that many of these bullets are fast and hard to see against many of the backgrounds here as well. In stark contrast to games like Dumpatch, where all of the bullets are a retina-scorching pink, many of the bullets are neutral colors like gray and brown, almost like in Battle Garega. Other times, the bullets were really tiny, making them a pain to track even when they were a decent color. They can also be a little drifty, moving around the playfield in a manner that isn't consistent with the stage's scroll, making them less precise to dodge.
Guardian Force also takes place over the course of 7 lettered main stages, which are preceded by an extra practice stage and topped with an additional final boss plus stage after stage G. These stages go on for a very long time, making for a grueling playthrough when combined with the constant barrage of cheap enemies and shots coming from everywhere and not quite enough firepower to adequately take them all out. They definitely overstay their welcome. A 6-stage set might have been a better fit.
We wish that we had more fun with this game, but outside of the neat dynamic scrolling and turret-based weapons, the rest of the gameplay is kind of unremarkable, giving way to more frustration than we care to admit. There's probably a reason that Guardian Force gives the players an uncharacteristically high 10 credits by default, and all of the difficulty levels feel quite a bit higher than advertised, thanks to even the smaller enemies' inherent sponginess. In fact, we made it just as far on very hard as we did on very easy using all 10 credits.
We know this game has its fans, and we can sort of see the appeal when using certain bullet-canceling weapons. But from a purely objective, analytical point of view, there are many more games on the Saturn that not only play better, but also feel way more satisfying. The fun factor of a game such as Thunder Force or Dodonpachi isn't really here. If this game was made after twin-stick controls were the norm, and those controls were added, it might have fared a little better than it does here. Still, there are conditions for multiple endings to the game, which gives it a bit of replayability, and for those that do want to dig a little deeper, a decent scoring system also resides within Guardian Force.
Scoring in Guardian Force relies on a couple of different factors. Enemy destruction and bullet impacts in general do a fine enough job, but the first thing players are going to want to focus on is meddling. Most ground-based enemies and targets will leave behind a small crest that can be picked up for points. When the last crest of a specific type is collected, the next will be of a higher value. Like the Force Crystals, these crests will also typically bounce, requiring care to collect.
Starting at 100 points, the player can grow these crests to a maximum individual value of 12,800 points each. Players should be careful though, especially in areas with diagonal scroll. It is very easy for a crest to travel off screen, and even if one is missed, they will need to be grown again from their base value. The player will also receive a number of bonus crests when the stage boss is defeated, so maintaining a high crest value is helpful in this regard.
Another big scoring mechanic is applied through speedy sub-boss kills. The faster a player can dispatch a mid-boss, the better the bonus will be. A timer will be displayed while taking these large enemies on, and the time remaining will be multiplied by 10,000. So, if a timer has 6.7 seconds left on it, a bonus of 67,000 points is applied. Large bonuses of over 100,000 points can be had with speedy kills, resulting in over 10 seconds left on the clock.
A number of other bonuses exist. Collecting Force Crystals gives players 1,000 points, weapon pickups of the same type can be grabbed for 5,000, and challenging destructible points in various stages and on bosses can reward the player with a tidy extra sum.
But there's another daring secret score point too. After weapon change items cycle through all of their colors, they will eventually go dark. When no color is displayed, they can be collected for 10,000 points. But it goes even further. If the player allows them to fall to the ground and disintegrate, they'll be worth 50,000 points if players can nab them. It's a super risky bonus, but it's well worth it if it can be done consistently.
So the scoring system isn't terribly complicated, but it can be challenging to maximize, which is important as players will only obtain an extended every 2 million points. Of course, continuing wipes the score, but will also kill any chance for it to be ranked in.
As is typically the case of this generation's games, there is no online leaderboard support in Guardian Force, instead relying on the system's battery backup or cartridge save to keep the player's high scores alive. Found in the options menu, leaderboards are kept for each difficulty in the game. So, the gameplay and scoring may not be as grand or as polished as we would have expected, but Guardian Force's presentation is the real slap to the face. While serviceable on some levels, there's a lot here that could have been much, much better.
Visually, Guardian Force is actually super cool. The backgrounds and set pieces work decently, despite most areas using dark color schemes. The enemies, mid-bosses, and bosses also have some really cool designs that we actually dig quite a bit. All of the weapons look pretty snazzy here too, especially at full power.
The main problem with the visuals, once again, is how the backgrounds, regardless of the stage, will do a really good job of hiding many of the enemy's shots. All kinds of shots with all kinds of different colors are launched at the player throughout the game, and there'll always be at least one type that'll just blend right in. It would have been nice if there was more of a consistent color choice for bullets allowing for better visibility, but such is Guardian Force.
But the sound is where Guardian Force really nosedives. We can deal with a lackluster soundtrack if it fits the bill. But while the first stage players will take on has a pretty good track, most of the rest are generally poor and mismatched to the overall theme. There's a heavy emphasis on long, drawn-out, bonging bells, and just a ton of weak MIDI-style instruments that had us scratching our heads.
But while the quality of the OST might be arguable by some in its favor, the sound effects can just get straight the hell out of here. While some, like the explosions, can be decent at best, the majority are objectively terrible, especially the level-up effects. Even the player shots have an odd bit-crushed bonging effect when fired. We did like the Beak's explosion effect, though mostly because it sounded like a cool Game Boy effect, which once again doesn't match what's going down here.
We'll concede that the rank-in sequence and leaderboard are still really cool, and the option menu BGM is probably the best track in the game. Rounding out the presentation is a decent menu system and clean UI, which is the very least we'd expect.
So, how does Guardian Force stack up? Let's take a look. Moving the player's tank around the screen is fast enough, but it somehow feels both squirrely and slow at times.
Dealing with drifty bullets can be an issue, and the turret can sometimes be a bit confusing when the stage scrolls in certain directions.
When it comes to its challenge, it will take a while to learn and map out this game, but it's still very easy to be overwhelmed by enemies that take quite a bit more damage than one might expect.
All 5 difficulties also don't feel especially different from each other. They're all just hard.
A game with 8 stages, including the quote-unquote practice stage, would normally score high.
But this is a game that just basically drags on for well over 40 minutes per playthrough.
The visual design in Guardian Force is actually pretty cool. A lot of the big enemy ships, tanks, and aircraft are pretty neat, and the Force crystals have one of the cooler visual details we've seen.
But there will be times where shots get lost against many of the backgrounds.
When it comes to sound, it's easily the weakest aspect of Guardian Force. The practice stage BGM track gives way to some really bizarre out-of-place music that had us wondering how anyone thought they were a good fit.
This game could have benefited from Red Book audio tracks. Add to that some really annoying sound effects and, well, you get it.
There are some cool ideas at play in Guardian Force. The asymmetrical weapons, the interchangeable turrets, and the dynamic scrolling are all cool concepts.
But the spongy enemies and bosses and the overall execution is definitely not where we'd have liked it. This could have made a cool twin-stick game though.
Guardian Force is a very expensive game on the Saturn thanks to its sole console exclusivity and late print run.
Its asking price is nowhere near worth it. If this is a game you really want, buy as low as possible if you can.
When a game like this commands the kind of prices it does at auction, we tend to expect at least a good game. It definitely lacks the greatness that other titles of similar cost have. Guardian Force is absolutely not the kind of game anyone should be shelling out hundreds of dollars for. It's insultingly expensive. However, it still has merit if players have the patience for it, but its overall lack of thrills and polish, especially in its sound, and overabundance of frustration, make this a game that few are likely to grow fondly attached to. Guardian Force gets a 3.25 out of 5. And we're being generous because of the sum of its parts. Guardian Force can be obtained at auction fairly easily, but it's gonna cost you, both from your wallet and, for some like us, maybe even your dignity. This has got to be the most infuriatingly lackluster $300 I've spent for the show so far. Like, I'm kinda salty over it.
Yeah, I'm pretty disappointed with this one too.
I just know we're gonna be slammed with comments telling us how wrong we are, but we've been at this for like 11 years. How could this game be so out of place on the Saturn unless it was actually not that great?
I mean, chances are.
Well, we've got a few heavy hitters coming up in the next few episodes. I hope those were worth the cost.
You and me both.